Welcome, my friends, to the Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, occult researcher Michael Joseph returns to the show. This conversation with Michael is part one of a multi-segment presentation. For this discussion, Michael explains how the science of Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Kepler was steeped in esoteric theology and how their belief system could have been a motivating driver behind their heliocentric model. Due to the complexity of the material presented, it is recommended to watch the slideshow as we make our way through the discussion in order to fully understand Michael's explanations and insights. Michael makes no claim that his research or interpretations on this topic are definitive or absolute. He is simply offering his insights based upon his research. The occult is a complex topic, and there will be different schools of thought on meaning and applications of occult knowledge. And to kick this show off, Michael explains how church, state, and science may not be as separate as we are led to believe. And so without further ado, here's Michael Joseph.
This just shows visually how all of these organizations work together. The Vatican meeting up with the United States government. Top left, we have Guy Consolmagno. He's the head Vatican astronomer currently. And then we have Pope Francis meeting with Obama. And we'll go over the little esoteric symbolism there afterwards. But we're supposed to believe that church and state are separate, but why the hell are they working together so much, you know? And this is one of those things that's just, I think it's so obvious, but people don't think about it. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Just how much they work together. And if people, you know, again, I kind of appeal to the people who really despise religion, but are just really pro-science. Well, why are these people in astronomy that are tied to religious organizations, why are they meeting with the United States government? Like, why are they even working together at all? Like, people don't even think about how weird that is, I think. And so then we have Pope Francis with the United Nations, and the United Nations works with NASA. They have UNUSA, which is the Office for Outer Space Affairs of the United Nations. And they did this little collaboration with Scott Kelly, one of the guys on the ISS, as we're told. And, you know, why space matters. So you see a little picture there, and it was some sort of collaboration. So the UN, NASA, United States government, the Vatican, they're all working together with this. And in some of the earlier videos, I established this. And even Guy Consolmagno, he says in an interview that so many of the people who have given us our modern science have theological backgrounds. Now, a lot of those guys actually have pretty esoteric theological backgrounds, but he goes through this whole list of guys, and, you know, obviously George Lemaitre, the Big Bang creator, the main guy who founded the theory.
Yeah.
He was a priest. And so, you know, like that stuff's like sort of common knowledge, but at the same time, if you really think about it, that's just so weird. You know, if you have all these people who are, the Big Bang's how it happened and there's no God, whatever. But it's just like, well, a priest came up with that. Like, it blows my mind how obvious that is, but nobody really thinks about it, you know?
Yeah, I don't think, Michael, that it really is common knowledge. I think if you ask most people how the Big Bang Theory was, how it was devised or who came up with it, they would draw an absolute blank.
I guess what I mean by that is, like, they'll show specials on it talking about him that are like, you know, Discover programs or stuff like that. Meaning it's put out to the masses in media or television programs talking about science. Now, again, most people probably don't know that, as you said, but it's not that it's like overtly hidden or trying to be concealed, you know.
No, they put it out there, but what happens is we have within society, the masses, cognitive dissonance, right? So they believe one set of beliefs or values or rules, if you will. As an example, church and state are separate. And then, you know, we have the reality of the situation, which is what you're taking us through, which is, well, guess what? It's not. And folks don't look at the piece that is the not aspect of the equation, which is, you know, the Vatican working with the governments and so on. And another point, not to jump around here, was the top right picture is very interesting to me with Bill Nye, with deGrasse Tyson, with Obama. I mean, those two guys, they're actors, they're celebrities, they're pitchmen, if you will, right? And there they are with the president of the United States. that to me looks odd.
Taking a selfie.
Yeah, it looks very odd to me.
Yeah.
It's, some people might not think that that's odd, but my first inclination was, what is Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye doing with the President of the United States?
Yeah, I think it's weird, and it is very celebrity-esque. Like, it's a picture you'd see in, like, Us Weekly, maybe. I don't know.
Exactly.
But anyways, just to wrap up this slide, you have Obama hanging out with Scott Kelly, and then we have Guy Consolmagno shaking hands with Pope Francis. And that's not outwardly weird because they're both, involved in the Vatican, but
right.
They're both Jesuit backgrounds, I believe. And obviously most people in the conspiracy world are familiar with a lot of the stuff about the Jesuits. And that's not something I really get into because people have just covered that all over the place. But it is noteworthy to me to point that out. I've listened to Guy Consolmagno talk a few times just on some random YouTube videos, and I gotta say, like, I don't see anything wrong with the guy. He seems like a nice guy. Like, I can't say something bad about the person. So I'm not trying to demonize people here, but just show that there are some suspicious things. Now, Pope Francis is a different story. I get really heated when I start talking about him. For some reason, he just irks me, rubs me the wrong way, pisses me off. I think I went on a little rant on the higher side chats about him. But so whatever reason, intuitively, just when I hear them talk, Guy Consolmagno, I don't really get some weird vibe from. Now, I don't know. Maybe he's involved in some strange, nefarious thing or not. I don't know. But I really try not to be judgmental of people, even people who are involved in organizations that I view to be highly suspect. So that's just kind of where I want to go with it. Last thing before we move on, just mention some Freemasonic motifs here. And again, if you read esoteric literature and understand it to some degree, this idea of the three pillars that we talked about in the last discussion, you can see that going on with Obama and Pope Francis, where you have the state on the left and then the church on the right. So it's like the dark pillar and the light pillar, and they're shaking hands. So that's like the unification of them. And that's pretty much the crux of alchemy, is unifying the opposites into an equilibrium. And that equilibrium is more reflective of deity, because deity is a union of these opposites, whereas the dispersion of them is what creates the duality and good and evil and things like that. And that is really the fundamental thing to understand about all of this. And I'll just describe this a little bit later in another slide. So just wanted to point that out. You can see these motifs everywhere. And once you start examining and reading a lot of the esoteric stuff, it kind of gets redundant after a while. You just see it everywhere. You're like, oh my God. And, again, sometimes what is it? Is it just programming? It's stuff that we've just become accustomed to. It's like a handshake. Yeah, I mean, everybody shakes hands, but it's just, to them, I think it's a bit more symbolic of these things. And, who knows if Obama even knows what he's doing there? You know what I mean? But who set these things up? Who set these photos up? It's very strange. There's a lot of these motifs that you can find, the light pill and the dark pill are unifying. And that's pretty much going to be the fundamental theme of like everything that we look at.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've learned, Michael, digging into the occult and the esoteric and the mystery religions, is everything is about signs and symbols. The profane, those that are in the unknowing category, me.
Me too.
We don't know this stuff, and we're learning it, yes, but even to the degree that we learn, we're just scratching the surface. And what amazes me is just that's how they do it. That's how they communicate, is signs and symbols. They don't go out there and talk about it. They'll talk, but what you really have to be watching is the symbols and the signs, if you really, really want to understand what's going on and what it is that they're really saying.
And even symbols being in the language and like speeches and stuff, they give a lot of
right,
like kind of allegorical type language.
Yes.
It's really strange, especially when you like listen to some speeches of like presidents and things like that. There's, if you know some of the mythology or read some of the literature, you can start spotting these strange things. And even before I knew a lot of this stuff, I always remember growing up, like listening to certain politicians speak or religious leaders speak. I'm just like, who writes this crap? Like, it was just like, you know what I mean? It was just something that was weird about it, you know? And if you're like sort of in the matrix and you don't think there's anything weird going on, like, you know, with all of this esoteric knowledge, you don't know any about that. But I'm just like, these speeches are just so overly dramatic and ridiculous. And then now you realize that that's very important, because I think that they think it engages certain elements of our psyche, all of these different mythologies or allusions to things and stuff like that. That's what I think is kind of going on with it.
I would agree. I would agree that. And I was going to say, and numbers, they love numbers, you know, which is part of the whole signs and symbols aspect of this.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a great slide.
Yeah, so basically to the quote-unquote profane, people think church and state are separate. And that is essentially kind of like the idea of the demiurge. The profane are supposedly in line with the demiurge mode of consciousness. And that is, again, stuff we discussed last time, where the occultists see the attributes, the outer attributes of the Old Testament God as being in duality. And so that is the outer meaning. That's the literal meaning. That is the quote unquote profane meaning. And the secret esoteric meaning is something that can be derived from that secretly. So the secret, true supreme being is still in the Old Testament, but it's hidden. And that's where all the Kabbalistic interpretations come in. And that's something that I can elaborate on if we want to go on to the next slide.
Okay. We're there. You have Copernicus and Newton and Kepler and Galileo.
Yeah, so this is kind of in the lines of the theology I was talking about. What I've come to understand about this is that the idea that there are veiled secrets in Scripture to reveal the quote-unquote highest God, that's kind of like the crux of the theological component in, biblical texts, esoteric texts, religious texts. But you can apply that to the material world. So this is why it's interesting how science, you'll see a lot of shows that are talking about the deep inner secrets of the material world. And that is how you can find the hidden deity, the grand architect, supreme being, whatever you want to call it, through that. Whereas the outer nature is dualistic, like hurricanes create destruction. And then, the calm after the storm, kind of like, I guess in summertime, things are growing, the sun brings the light, and then it dies in the winter. So that's sort of like the duality. So they see this outer material world as a reflection of the mode of consciousness of the demiurge creator God in occult Gnosticism. So if you worship like the outer version of nature, that's like the exoteric paganism. If like, oh, please, great thunder God, don't hurt me. The occultists would think that's ridiculous. And so that would be kind of like worshiping the demiurge. So any of these pagan gods that are just the in-your-face, angry, wrathful gods that are anthropomorphic that we talked about.
Yeah.
That would be sort of in line with that. But if you look to all these inner secrets, that's the idea that you can reveal the highest God. So it's an as above, so below. The theological component of the Bible is like the spiritual nature, and then the material world, you can still do that. So that's what's very interesting about a lot of the science we're given, and maybe some of the prominent figures like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan.
Michael, do they view the material world, the physical world, as profane? Is that what you're saying?
In its outer sense, but if you are able to break it down, you can find the divine secrets. And that's really what a lot of the alchemical components in like chemistry, if you're going to try to unify these above science and below science, that's kind of what it seems to be derived from. And so what I'm getting at with those guys is, everything is like these secrets of the universe, secrets of everything, and they're revealing them to you. So they're like this hierophant figure where they're revealing the sacred mystery. So they're doing a different version of it where it's like they're showing the material secrets, whereas the Vatican is showing the scriptural secrets. And when I listen to Pope Francis's speech and stuff, he's using a lot of esoteric language, especially talking about how the Western world is like worshiping the golden calf and the idolatry of money and all this stuff. That's the allegory esoterically for the golden calf, which we talked about last time. So it's almost like they're doing both sides of the pillars and they're unifying them themselves with their esoteric language on it. But unless you're an adept and you understand what they're saying, you wouldn't know. But they seem to have this like weird initiation process that they're trying to enact. And we're kind of getting it without knowing it. You know, for whatever that means, like, I don't know if deGrasse Tyson is part of some secret society. Like I said, maybe it's just sort of like you go through a certain education and you have a certain mindset. And maybe if it's enough in line with esoteric occultism, they put you in that position because you kind of believe enough of it to be useful. Or maybe he's full blown, straight up Mason who had some Masonic ritual. Like, I don't know. I don't want to make a judgment on the person, but it is strange, which we'll get to later on at the end, how so much of the mystery religion's ideas of history align to what Cosmos, with both Sagan and deGrasse Tyson, present as being historical figures like Copernicus, and kind of the picture they paint of them as being like good or bad, that kind of thing. So
it's interesting because you mentioned idolatry and the golden calf, and the thought that crossed my mind was, well, they created that. They created that profane environment.
Yeah. I guess I can say one thing to that before we get into these guys. Kind of the idea of alchemy, like I said, is unifying the opposites. So kind of an allegory I can come up with is if I'm standing in the sunlight during the day, the sun is like, you know, an allegory for this divine light, and it hits me in my material form. And since that hits the material, it casts a shadow. And so that shadow is like kind of like the dark pillar, and the part of me that's being illuminated by the light is kind of like the light pillar. And so you can take that material phenomena and apply an esoteric mode of psychology to it, where the way they kind of look at alchemy, I think, is kind of like taking yourself and just mashing yourself into your shadow. And that creates this chaos.
Yeah.
But through that merging of these polar opposites, they can birth a new self. And that's what it seems to be, this constant ritual of death and rebirth, but you're doing it like with an esoteric purpose. Now, I'm not saying that purpose is good or bad. I'm just saying that this is the concept. And you can believe that you're doing that purpose for good, but I mean, you know, look around us and look what's going on. I don't see it as good, but like that's an explanation possibly for all of the crazy materialistic stuff you see in the entertainment world. But then sometimes they release esoteric things, like certain movies are very Masonic, and I talk about the movie The Game a lot in relation to this. So there is some stuff like that mixed in with these movies that are just about really dumb shit, and, you know, and like overtly profane type things. So they create this duality, but I think they have some sort of plan to unify it however they see fit. And that's kind of what they do to steer us in certain directions. So I don't want to elaborate too much on that because it's so easy to get into the theological stuff, but that's kind of something to always keep in mind.
Okay, well, I didn't want to derail you there. So maybe...
No, I derail myself. But anyways, let's get to these guys.
Yeah, let's talk about Copernicus, I guess.
Okay, we can kind of apply these concepts to this. So all of the videos for these slides, in the upper left, I'll have a little description of what videos you can watch in the occult series. So if you go to my YouTube channel, the Occult Science series, just click on the playlist and it has all of these videos, and you can just kind of go to whichever one you might want to look at for all of the source reading and, you know, basically what I use to source the material. So I try to go through Nicholas Copernicus and read his own writing and try to see what is there esoterically. So that's where all this is derived from. I'm summarizing what I said in the videos, but this all has source reading for it. So I'm not just like pulling it out of my ass, basically. So anyways, Copernicus. One thing that's interesting about him is he corresponded with popes and cardinals about heliocentrism. Now, when I grew up, I was always kind of under the impression that, you know, all of these founding fathers of science, Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, or whatever, you know, they were all just pure men of reason, science, and they just had nothing to do with religion, wanted nothing to do with it. And, you know, they were fighting this religious oppression. But to the contrary, they're all extremely religious. And that's something that's weird because nobody really tells us that. It is in university level research that this is the case, But like, why aren't we taught growing up when we're younger? Oh yeah, Nicholas Copernicus, he was a priest, and Neil deGrasse Tyson even said he was a priest in Cosmos. And
Now, Michael, when you say religious, so we can kind of baseline the audience here, a lot of folks are going to wonder, well, what do you mean by that? Is he a Christian? Is he Jewish? I mean, what are we talking about?
Well, again, I refer people to go to our last discussion and then figure out what the language on both an Orthodox version and the esoteric version, and you will find that these guys all have a lot of philosophies and ideologies aligning with the esoteric side. And that's what I'm trying to kind of prove here, that there at least is a parallel consciousness with these concepts.
So are we referring more to the mystery religions?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And what they were rebelling against, quote unquote, is the more Orthodox version. So we're led to believe that it was the Orthodox oppression that was the bad thing, but we aren't told there's an esoteric religious component unless you start digging into it, you know? So from what I found digging into it is, Copernicus also talked about the sphere shape being divine. And so if he's talking with the Pope, I mean, he's the Pope, about heliocentrism and he's not being persecuted for it, like that's very different than what we think about, you know? And so he talks about the nature of the sphere is the nature of deity, because the center point of the sphere, that is where everything emanates from and creates infinite points on the sphere around it. It's kind of abstract. I'm not really good with science type stuff like material science, so I'm just trying to convey what I know about the esoteric component of it. But this idea of the sphere is very important, and what's at the center is what creates the outward points of the sphere. And so he basically says that that is the nature of deity, spherical. And if you see like the glyph for the sun in like astrology, you'll see a dot at the middle with a circle around it. You know, it's kind of expressing the same thing. And if the sun is sort of like this allegorical symbol for the nature of deity, then the heliocentric model has some association to that. So already we have heliocentrism and a divine sphere, and that's part of our accepted cosmology, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting to me, because if the sphere is deity, it's divine, the globe is a divine shape, you know, you really start to maybe perhaps connect the dots on why it is that everything is a big ball in space, right? Why the Earth has to be a sphere and so on. So that's all I'll say about it. I remember when you showed me this slide when we did the pre-show about a week ago or so. It's a great slide because, at least for me, it started to fill in some blanks. I mean, I don't know if I'm filling them in correctly, but I did feel like I started to maybe piece some things together. So anyway, like I said, I don't want to keep you from taking us through everybody else here, but that was a big point for me, is this whole thing where the sphere is divine.
Yeah. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this shows a motive to be biased.
Yeah.
And if all of these guys are revered as these brilliant minds, and if the people who are running this are esoterically minded and they're revering these guys, are they kind of one and the same in their ideology? So basically, Copernicus also says that the globe is a divine shape attributed to the universe. He says the universe is globe shaped. And the universe is extremely important because that's seen as the visible God. It's what we can see, and looking to the heavens is like looking up above the profane, the earthly nature of man. And just doing that will make you more divine intellectually, so to speak. Copernicus, he says the reason that he was afraid to release his heliocentric model is because he thought that the other scientists or also philosophers would mock him, but in a way that they're just kind of philosophically profane. Like they don't understand philosophy in a high level, that's the reason they'll mock them. So basically, have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. It's kind of like that. He didn't want to be Luke Wilson, where he's telling everybody that you got to give the plants water and not Brawndo to grow. And then everyone's so dumb, they'll look at him and be like, well, you're an idiot. You know what I mean? Like that's what he's basically saying. He didn't want to be that guy. So that's why he didn't want to put it out there. it wasn't because he was afraid of religious persecution by the church. And that's the point I'm trying to make.
So he was afraid of being ridiculed.
Yeah. But it was sort of like in a pretentious way, I guess. That's at least what I get from the writing. And people can go to that video and I'll go through the source reading. And if you read that passage differently than me, that's what it's there for.
Well, he didn't want to be ridiculed by people that he believed were less of an intellect than him. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
That's part of it. And basically, it was other scientists. But at that time, science and philosophy were kind of merged together a lot.
Yeah.
And so that's what he was afraid of. It wasn't because he was afraid of being burnt at the stake by the Inquisition, like most people will think, or that's what you're kind of led to believe. And there are some figures, obviously, like Giordano Bruno, that applies to, but we'll get into that later. But so he also used a lot of esoteric language when he describes his theology. And in the videos, I go through it and I kind of explain it. And people who have been looking at some of this stuff will probably just kind of see it pop out and be like, oh, that is, definitely allusions to the more Gnostic Christianity type of thinking. And so that pretty much sums him up. But again, this idea that the visible God, the universe, is so awesome and divine and sort of like this visible reflection of the supreme being, that kind of translates over to the Cosmos series being obsessed with the universe. And isn't it grand? You know what I mean? Like they're it's just like when you hear deGrasse Tyson, those people talk about it, they're so enamored with it. Like it's so divine and great, even though people think that they're like, they're atheists or something, but they kind of have this strange infatuation with it. And that mode of thinking is very much in line with all of this in terms of the universe. So just wanted to point that out. And we can go on to, I guess, Galileo.
Okay.
Just to go by the timeline here. He was a professional astrologer for royalty, and also he cast horoscopes for himself and his family. And some people might say, oh, well, he was only casting horoscopes for royalty to kind of schmooze them. And I'm not even negating that, but he cast them for his own family and himself. So I'm pretty sure he was into it. You know what I mean? So people like to be like, oh, they just did that to make money, but they didn't actually believe in it because they don't want these people to be, they don't want, like the people who don't want astrology to be legitimate or really hate it. And I don't even care if people don't like astrology. I'm not out to convince anybody that it's real or not, but I'm just saying that Galileo was heavily into it.
Well, this wasn't horoscopes that are in the newspaper. I'm sure that right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that wasn't 3 lines. And I like to remind people that, and a lot of folks don't remember this, or maybe they didn't even know, but Ronald Reagan used to consult an astrologer while he was president. And I remember a couple of times that came out in the newspapers and people were joking because they were thinking that it's astrology that you would find in the daily newspaper. And that's not at all what was going on. So there's a whole aspect of this that has to do with astrology that is way, way above and beyond what the general masses believe it to be.
Yeah, and just a quick side note, there's a researcher, Robert Sullivan, he's a Freemason, he talks about cinema symbolism and stuff like that, and I heard him tell a story about Ronald Reagan being friends with Manly Palmer Hall and quoting him a bit and stuff like that. That guy has a lot of interesting stuff. If people haven't checked him out, I suggest you do that. But anyways, back to this. We can differentiate between the quote-unquote profane astrology and the esoteric ones when we get to Kepler. But oh yeah, the other thing is all these guys have a high esteem for Pythagoras, Copernicus especially. Pythagoras is generally considered the first Freemason, and that's where all the heliocentric stuff, as most people know it, comes from. The occult will trace it back to like Eastern theology and the Vedas and stuff like that. That's what Madame Blavatsky does. She sources everything back to the Eastern world, but you can watch videos on her in the series. I don't really cover that for this discussion, but anyways, Pythagoras extremely important. And also the other thing is Galileo actually made theological arguments to support heliocentrism, but he was advocating secret meanings in scripture. He was saying that the fault of the church is that they interpreted it literally. And he doesn't necessarily bash that. He says, I don't fault people for doing the literalism, but that's not the way to go. Now we need to go into the esoteric meanings. So he was actually using the Bible to try to reconcile heliocentrism, which is another thing that might weird some people out who aren't accustomed to, thinking that religion and science are connected. You know what I mean?
So was he using the Bible as an example or scripture as astrotheology?
He was using it as an authority to try to prove heliocentrism. He says that the Holy Bible cannot contradict truth, something of that effect, but you have to look to the esoteric kind of hidden meaning. So he's looking at it like an occultist trying to derive secrets in it, right? Like I was mentioning. And so let's just move on to Isaac Newton. He was doing the same thing. And I don't have a lot of source reading from Newton directly, but I do have a book. It's called The Foundations of Newton's Alchemy by Betty Jo Dobbs, I think her name is. And she was like a authority on Newton's alchemical stuff. That was like her scholarly area of expertise. And the other thing I want to point out is, unless I'm dealing with esoteric sources, I always try to use university level research to show anything and show kind of like the parallels. So I'm not like sourcing conspiracy websites or something like that. You know what I mean? So I'm just trying to provide sources that most people think are credible. And so if somebody's trying to present some of these things to people who want to, if you're not a scientist or if you're not quoting scholars, I'm not going to listen to you. And that's what I try to do. So if somebody who might be more on the side of the argument that they're trying to say, hey, wait a second, maybe some of this stuff isn't right, I'm just trying to say that I'm using university level research to help make my points. But anyway, so that book is really interesting. And the videos, I basically use her position where he was searching for divine secrets in esoteric literature, just like the occultists do. And these traditions are of Pythagoras, Plato, Hermes Trismegistus, the Kabbalah, Zoroastrianism, Vedic Brahmins, things like that. Everything that's encompassed in the mystery religion. And he also had inspiration for ideas about science that came from mythology. And he talked about inspiration for ideas about gravity and atoms and vacuums that came from the ancients and their conceptions about the Greek god Pan. So he was reading a lot of that stuff and kind of integrating it into his material science. He was trying to take esoteric concepts and apply them to the material. And that's kind of like the chemistry aspect of it. So Pan is, as far as I know, traditionally seen as more of like a demiurge god. But there's something about finding the secrets of the outer laws to find the divine laws of the highest God. So you can see a pattern here. You analyze the demiurge nature, you analyze the demiurge viewpoints of scripture, but then to move beyond that, you need to look to the esoteric secrets hidden within it. And so that kind of applies to pretty much everything, you know?
So their thought being that the clues are all there, but you have to read it and you have to understand it in a very different way.
Exactly. And so my point is that if Newton is one of these guys, responsible for gravity, the ideas, and then people were deriving equations based on his research, and his inspiration for science came from basically theology and esoteric theology, that's strange. You know what I mean? Like these guys who everyone thinks like the most brilliant men alive, and they created all this material science that can't be disproven. And then they got all the ideas for that material science from Kabbalah and stuff like that. I mean, it's like either all of these esoteric things just happen to be the truth by accident. And like if somebody wants to make a more atheistic argument, and again, I'm not pro-atheist, anti-atheist. I'm just saying that there's people that will not want to have anything to do with esoteric stuff, but then they'll really revere science. I'm saying the guys that are giving it to you were steeped in this stuff. So if they gave you stuff that was just true in the everyday world, but there is no metaphysical world, then what a complete accident that they would be deriving all of it from those things. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. And the point before, Michael, is that I'm reading the box here, and folks, you can read it too along with me because you're looking at the same slide. Isaac Newton, not one of those bullets ever showed up in any book I ever read when I was going to school.
Yeah, and you can see, again, now they have like specials on like Newton's alchemy, and they make it all secretive, and so it is out there that he was into this stuff. But again, when you're 13 years old in school, they're not going to tell you that.
No, that's what I'm saying. When you're going through school, you didn't read any of that. Yeah, today they'll put some shows out there, and allow you to dip your toe in the water a little bit. But, they're just giving you a bunch of nonsense. I mean, they're just trying to make it more exciting or mystifying the persona of Isaac Newton or Copernicus and so on. But they're not divulging any real truths.
Well, it's the mystery religion. You got to make it mysterious,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So anyways, to finish up Isaac Newton, some of his alchemical writings were about the transmutation of something profane into something better. So this idea of taking Jupiter's ego, and Jupiter in his demiurge sense. So in the story of Prometheus, Jupiter or Zeus punishes Prometheus. That would be the demiurge god. That would be like the demiurge Jehovah, that version, right? The profane god according to the occult. So in this sense, you're taking the eagle as a profane symbol and you're trying to transmute it into something better using this higher esoteric knowledge. So this idea of turning the eagle into a phoenix.
Which is the back of the dollar bill, right? They tell you it's an eagle, but it's really a phoenix rising.
Yeah, and that's what's the weird thing about the United States. And there's, I'm not going to get into it here. You can see it in the videos in the Occult Science series, but I go through a lot of parallels to us being the eagle and having to do with the sign of Scorpio, and how maybe part of America is this plan to be transmuted into something else. And, that was kind of Obama's MO, right? It's like, we will fundamentally transform America, right? The eagle being a symbol of transmutation, and also with the Apollo 11 thing. And I'll get into that more in the next talk. I don't want to get hung up here, but
okay.
So that's kind of summarizes Isaac Newton's camp. And the only other thing I'll mention about him is that later on, it's theorized he had a nervous breakdown, and then he started doing a lot of more orthodox type writing. He wrote a prophetic commentary on like the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, and he changed chronologies or tried to amend them. And he seemed like he was really viewing it from a literalist standpoint. I actually have the book on his prophecy stuff, and it's like, when I read it, I'm like, man, this sounds a lot like orthodoxy. I'm not saying it's exactly in line, but it sounds like he had a change of heart, or at least he went a different direction. And supposedly he had a fire that burnt a lot of his current work, which was the esoteric stuff. But it is kind of funny how we are told to view that period of his life as his crazy period, whereas all of his cool stuff came from the esoteric work, which, derived gravity and all the other things that people know him for as being a genius. And I have a video on Jean-Baptiste Biot, who was a biographer of Newton. Now, Biot was definitely an occultist, and he kind of did the same thing where he separated that. And that was actually this weird thing where that breakdown, or so-called breakdown, separated the exoteric and esoteric in a weird way. So everything in his early work was esoteric, and everything in his later work seemed to be more orthodox. So there seems to be a concerted effort to bash the Orthodox, and I'm not like, waving a flag for the Orthodox, or I'm not being like an apologist or something, but I am being objective that they do try to make the Orthodox seem way more evil than it is. And we'll get to that later in some of the historical stuff, and kind of as a straw man to prop themselves up as like way more superior, if you can see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think that, I'm the kind of person that I have affinities to both the Orthodox and Gnostic versions in certain instances, and I have things that I have problems with in both viewpoints, and that's something we can discuss in the next discussion. But there seems to be a little battle going on. That's all I'm trying to say. And they kind of get emotionally attached to bashing the Orthodox in terms of history, which we'll get into at the very end. So lastly, let's just go to Kepler. He advocated connections between spirit and matter, and this is kind of the idea of alchemy again. You need to blend the divine consciousness with the material for an equilibrium, and that's kind of like the destiny of man or something like that. This is the book of Revelation in a Kabbalistic sense. And to really help differentiate, if you hear people talk about Orthodox book of Revelation, everything is external. All this bad stuff's going to happen, but it's Jesus coming back literally, descending to the clouds is going to like fix everything, right? Whereas the Gnostic views that everything is internal and you have that Christ consciousness. And so this is kind of disturbing to me, but if you take everything that the Orthodox views about what Jesus is and what God is in an external sense, you can apply that to how the occultists might view what they are. So if they believe that they are God in the sense that the Orthodox views God, it's kind of disturbing because that means that they're the ones creating the New Jerusalem. They're the ones creating the millennium. They're the ones who they think are the elect and are going to basically make that come true in the way that they think they're the good guys in the book of Revelation.
Right.
If you can see what I'm saying.
Yep.
That's sort of like the Gnostic interpretation in a nutshell. Now, people will argue a lot about the semantics of all that, but that's something that I think can kind of differentiate the viewpoints and what might be going on in our world and what they're trying to like push towards, in my opinion. But that's something people can think about. But this union of spirit and matter is kind of like a big part of that. And Kepler was also a professional astrologer, but he was very critical of quote unquote soothsaying astrology or like fated astrology. And fate and karma, those are things attributed to the demiurge. And that's kind of like what you want to free yourself from, because that's like being in bondage. And so, you know, people that practice fated astrology be like, oh, I'm only going to date somebody who's a Libra because my chart says that. They would view that as being profane. So a lot of the astrology that's out there, you know, in that sense, the occultists would frown upon.
So it sounds like they also, frown upon, when you talk about, Michael, when you mentioned karma, do they frown upon karma also? Is this something that they believe is for the profane?
That's tough because I think that it's something that maybe they think they have a handle on how it works and maybe they're above it. You know, I don't know. It doesn't really specify too much, but I know that is attributed to the demiurge, basically. And getting out of the cycle of karma, I mean, that's kind of similar to Buddhist traditions where you don't want to be in that. You know what I mean? That's like kind of like the end goal of breaking that cycle.
Right.
It's pretty similar. And so that's something that, you know, I always wonder, and some people in the truther world kind of speculate upon. It's like, do they try to set things up so we karmically get ourselves involved where we do things that they want to manipulate, but they don't actually do them? They kind of trick us into doing it. Now, I'm not saying that means that their version of karma is reality, but maybe they just think that. So they could think that, oh, we know these are the rules and we don't violate them and we get the profane to do it and then we can perform our alchemy from that. To me, that doesn't necessarily mean that is the objective truth. That might be what they think they're doing.
Right. And I've always had a problem with that because I've had folks on the show and I've heard many, many other shows where they said that, well, they have to tell us what they're going to do. Otherwise, they can't do it. So they have to have consent. And they also know how to circumvent the karmic repercussions. And so, you know, people go off on that stuff. And the problem I have with that is that, first of all, you're just going off on it. You don't know. Somebody made it up somewhere. That's how I look at it. And then everybody else took the baton and ran down the track with it. And I agree with you that maybe, perhaps that's how they view it. I'm talking about the elites. But that doesn't mean that that's how it works. What I have told folks is, look, deception is not good. Deception is deception. Okay? So even if you are putting deception in play because you think that somehow you're going to circumvent karma, I'm going to tell you that you're wrong. And that there's universal law, that the creator, is not going to sit there and say, you got me, you found a little glitch in the rule book, and so you get $200, you can pass go. I don't think it works that way, Michael. I really don't. Again, somebody could say I'm wrong. I'm giving my opinion on this thing, but it just seems really weird to me that you're able to be deceptive and to steer people toward chaos and to steer them toward pain and confusion and anguish and think that it's okay because the way I'm going about it, I'm free of any kind of repercussions or any kind of karmic boomerang.
I completely agree with you on that. And in the next discussion, we can talk about, again, I think that is what they think.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that to be reality. So, yeah. But, you know, that's just the idea about the karma and fated astrology. And even Carl Sagan and Cosmos kind of shits on that type of astrology. I've watched some of the episodes, and it's funny because I think he's standing outside the statue of Prometheus talking about that in that episode. But basically, he also has apparently called Johannes Kepler the last scientific astrologer. And it's very interesting how Kepler is so bashing of soothsaying astrology, but he was into it for sure. And also, here's another very interesting thing about him. In his own writings, he says that curved lines are of deity, or the nature of deity, and straight lines are of the nature of man. And of course, man, is always the profane. That's of the earthly nature, right?
Yeah.
So a curved earth would be of deity, and a straight, flat plane would be of the nature of man. So again, I'm not saying that flat earth is profane, but I'm saying from the viewpoint of esoteric occultism, would be viewed that way.
The way I read that was you could very well be living on a flat plane, but that flat plane itself, being material and physical, is profane, and that there is ascension. There's a higher understanding of things, and in that higher understanding of things, that's where things become spherical, circular, curved lines, and so on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's kind of parallels what I was going to mention, where if you're an alchemist, to me, it's always as above, so below. So you look at the physical element of it, and then you derive that from the spiritual. And spiritual to me is sort of like the psychological component. So the nature of man being sinful, that's kind of like also a psychological thing. It's modes of consciousness. So again, I talk about somebody in life who can be a nice person sometimes, and then some silly thing can set them off, and all of a sudden they become some huge asshole. That's kind of like the duality. So basically, esoterically, the flat plane would be an allegory for that. Now, the material component of that is almost like secondary in the eyes of the esoteric world, because it's all about consciousness and things like that. Now, I'm not saying that the only thing that matters is the consciousness, but I do think that they view that as kind of like the first thing to go for. So if you're an alchemist and you want to make a profane world into unify with Godhead, then an allegorical thing you would do is make it curved versus straight. So it shows a motive to make it curved, and that they think that curved lines are more divine, which we'll get into in the next slide. So again, this just shows a motive. Now, whether or not we live on a flat plane or a sphere, I don't know. I don't really get into that. I'm not one of these people who's going to debate about flat Earth. I'm just showing esoteric components that could be motive to mold the world to your own viewpoint. That's what I'm trying
and
to
that
say.
was my point. My point was not to argue flat Earth or globe Earth. My point was that as I'm reading through this, you could very well be living on a flat Earth, but they look at that construct, if you will, not the belief, the construct, as profane. And so we have to, when we say we, I'm talking about them, we have to practice our theology, if you will, and put into play terminology, symbols, signs, and so on that have to do with spheres, with globes, circular, curved lines, and stuff like that, in order for them to ascend to whatever it is they believe that they're ascending to as adepts, initiatives, or whatever.
Exactly. So I just think it's very strange how he talks about the sphere same way Copernicus does the center point spreading out to infinite points. And he also made theological arguments to support heliocentrism by advocating secret meanings found in Scripture. So these guys are all of a similar mindset. That's what I'm trying to point out, or at least Newton in his esoteric sense. There's all some very profound connections between them, between Pythagoras, heliocentrism, spherical, curved, divine shapes, and kind of bashing the profane earthly nature of man. And so if theology is correct, then if the book of Revelation is supposed to be like a divine man in the end, then all of these things could be making profane things divine. That's like the crux of alchemy. That's what Baphomet is. I mean, you talked about it with Sophia Smallstorm.
This is a great slide. You took these four guys, and these four guys are very, very important, especially when we talk about science and the cosmos and all of that stuff. And by stitching this together the way you did, you connected the dots, you're showing potential motive here. You mentioned motive. Like I said, these guys are all singing out of the same hymnal. So it certainly looks like that their theology is the engine.
And to just kind of parallel it to Orthodox Christianity, obviously in the flat earth side of the argument, there's a lot of people that believe it for biblical reasons. And, if you follow somebody like Rob Skiba, he'll go through all of the passages where he says, I think the Bible is a flat earth book. And he does a lot of, I think, good work showing it from purely a theological perspective. But my point is, people will kind of be like, well, you're just a religious crazy and you want to deny reality. But like, these guys could have the same motive. Like, people will accuse Orthodox Christians of being like, well, if you're trying to, do scientific experiments and you believe the Bible is literal, then your experiments are going to be biased because of that. I think people kind of assume that.
Yeah.
Sometimes, or they can make that critique, if you will. But I'm saying, why can't you just flip the script here? It's like these guys are all talking about divine spheres and heliocentrism, which we'll get into in the next discussion as to a more visual representation of why it works better in esoteric theology. But, you could if we didn't know about any of the actual physical experiments, let's just throw that out the window. Theologically, there's motivations to be biased to either one. So again, I'm not saying that, I'm happy to see people out there doing physical experiments and stuff like that. I am admittedly just dumb with science. This is part of why I don't take sides with this kind of stuff. And I'm more concerned about how people treat each other in the process. I just prefer to remain civil about it. And I have affinities with both sides of the argument. So I'm kind of a diplomat about it. But again, my whole point is these guys have a motive to be deceitful if they wanted to. But, just because somebody has a belief doesn't mean that their points are good or bad. Examine the points, but be aware that they could be biasing something, but you still need to look at the information and really try to separate yourself. Like say you don't like Christianity. Let's just say you're that person that you think that that's all the problems. But what if there's a Christian that's giving information that is actually objective? I'd hate to see somebody throw that out because they have a preconceived notion about them, or vice versa with the occultist viewpoint. You know what I mean? So I just really encourage people to try to be objective and honest with themselves. And if somebody doesn't have a worldview you have, still try to think that, they can make good points, because that's the only way I've gotten through all of this stuff, is to really try to not be judgmental of people if they don't share my viewpoints, and just be honest about what they're putting forth.
It's interesting because I studied Christianity, Michael, for over 3 years, going back years ago, but I really dove into it. And I found that Christians are very good at dissecting the atheists, and the atheists are very good at dissecting the Christians, So what happens is that's why you can't just throw it out. And there are people that do that. There are people that just won't listen to something because somebody's an atheist, or they won't listen to something because somebody's a Christian. But what I do is I listen to both sides, because at the end of the day, you listen to the arguments here and the arguments there. And then if you bring them together, you basically should walk out of the room with something that resembles somewhat near the truth. I'm not saying it's the truth, but it's been vetted. It's been vetted by these guys throwing stones at that guy and that guy throwing stones at the other guy. And when the smoke settles, you're sitting there going, okay, well, you know what? I have a clearer picture of what is and what is not.
Yeah, and that perfectly segues into the next slide.
Sure. There's the profane flat earth.
Yeah. And so, again, this can be an allegory for a mode of consciousness. So I'll get into this in a minute, but I'll just describe, if you remember in our last discussion, I think in the very beginning, I read a quote by Albert Pike, and he talked about what the compass and square means. And basically the first and the last lessons of Freemasonry is about the compass and the square, kind of like the alpha and the omega. He's kind of like invoking that. But the last lesson of Freemasonry, which I would think is pretty important, right? He tells you of the nature of the compass and the square, and he kind of elaborates on it. And basically, to summarize it, he says the compass is for spheres and spherical surfaces and represents spherical trigonometry, and that deals with the heavens, the intellectual and moral portion of man, so the divine aspects. And this would have to do with like Prometheus, because intellect, knowledge, wisdom, those are all kind of reason. That's another thing you'll hear a lot. Those are all, words to be allegories of the highest deity. So they think that intelligence and intellect in its pure form, being purely rational, can only lead you to God because it only makes sense that there is a God, but it's the supreme architect. So they really believe that their religion is true. That's something I didn't really mention before. Blavatsky basically talks about how esoteric occultism reconciles every difficulty and they are the truth. So they really believe that this is the truth. And that is where it gets concerning, because if you really believe that this is the truth, and if you're so blinded by that, and it might not be, that gives you even more motive to form all these things in your own mind because you are convinced it's true. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, you see it in everyday life. You see it in yourself a lot too. And this is what you kind of have to deconstruct about yourself. It's like when you believe certain things and you don't want to believe otherwise, and it starts creating all these problems in your life because it's not right, you can either keep going with it and deny all these problems and externalize them onto something else, or you can realize that, hey, you know what? I didn't cause all these problems necessarily completely, but I had a very large hand in creating them. And so that's something that's been a theme in my life. And so who knows if that's what's going on with all this stuff. But basically, this nature of the compass, it's spiritual, it's the divine nature, the divine consciousness. And so spherical trigonometry in a mathematical sense would represent that. So what do you do to calculate spherical Earth and curvature? You use spherical trigonometry, right? Again, I'm not a mathematician, but I think that's probably pretty obvious.
Well, I mean, the compass part, going back to what you said before, and it's on this chart here, we're talking about circular or curved lines is divine, right? And then you have the square at the bottom. And what does the square give you? Straight lines. Straight lines is profane.
Yeah. And then Albert Pike says that square is for plane surfaces only. And he makes an allusion to the flat earth that, which the ancients, I guess the profane ancients, because in esoteric philosophy, ancient wisdom is divine. But again, there's probably esoteric, exoteric stuff going throughout time with all of this. But either way, he says, which they thought was a flat earth essentially, or a flat plane. And he says that this deals with the sensual and baser portions of man's lower nature. So this would be like Epimetheus, if you wanted to go to Prometheus. That's like his brother, and he's seen as more of like the materialistic, short-sighted version, where Prometheus is the one who has foreknowledge or foresight. He's of a higher consciousness, so he can see, greater things. And of course, Prometheus outside of Rockefeller Center, which we'll get into in the next discussion, because I don't really want to go into that tangent, but he's a very, very important figure in all of this. And I think that reading the chapter on Prometheus from Madame Blavatsky, it's in volume 2 of The Secret Doctrine, Anthropogenesis, page 409, 422. If anybody wants to read that, I highly suggest you do, because I think that chapter gives tons of insight into what they might believe, especially in relation to Prometheus. But anyways, so the profane nature, this would be like the demiurge Zeus nature that punishes Prometheus. So this is kind of like the theocracy allegory, the profane consciousness that's punishing the divine light that's trying to enlighten them, and they are just too stupid to realize that they're trying to help. That's kind of the essence of that story. So Luke Wilson in that movie is essentially Prometheus. People can say, well, Prometheus, if that's the Illuminati, then, anything having to do with that story must be evil. But I'm saying, well, it's a story. Why can't you flip the script on it and be like, hey, maybe Prometheus in a certain sense could be like, the truther community. We're trying to show people that, hey, there's a lot going on to these events like 9/11, JFK than we're being told by the media. So we can take it back, man.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't look at this literature and stuff like that as being like bad. Obviously they use it, but there's a certain element that, hey, we can find something that we can resonate with that in there. So that's why if somebody is like really interested in the occult, but they're obviously anti New World Order, maybe that's some way you can reconcile how they seem to be using all of these things, and you can still find some profundity into it. And so that's a little bit of a tangent, but the point being, the square being profane, Earth is basically depicted as a cube in the occult. You've seen the cube. Obviously, we talked about this a little bit before, the black cube at Mecca. And I always show the Mac Store cube in New York City, which is illuminated. And so that's kind of like an illuminated Earth, right? And then the apple being bited taking a bite out. Like that's an allegory for the gnosis in the garden. So the mat cube is illuminating mankind with technology, and the black cube is, basically that's like a demiurge earth. So Islam would represent that to them. But again, they still need to use the profane in alchemy. And that's the point I want trying to make, try to get across. When people think, oh, they worship Saturn and all this stuff, maybe there's groups out there that do that. I don't know. But everything that I get from the symbolism is the opposite. But they need to use that profane, or at least according to them, that profane consciousness. So this is why I think a lot of that Saturn symbolism is out there, because it's always got to be utilized in alchemy. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they worship it. And I think that is an area where people might get confused on a lot. Now, this is why I think that they believe what they're doing is good or righteous. Now, I don't think it is. And that's something where people might think I'm like an elite apologist. Absolutely not. But I'm saying that from their mindset, I think that they are doing us a service, which is so fucked up. But that is one thing when people are doing something that they think is right. To me, like the microcosmic example is like the social justice warrior. They believe they're doing something good. You know what I mean? They believe they're in the right, and they think that you're ignorant because you're racist or you're hateful or whatever. When you're just questioning, hey, the way you're going about things, I don't think is a good way to do it. I agree with you. I don't like racism. I don't like, being anti other cultures. But what's happening with all this stuff, there's some concerns and levels of discussions that need to be had, but they're so blinded to thinking that they're righteous and morally superior, then they create all this destruction because of it. So to me, that's sort of a microcosmic example of how I kind of categorize what I think about the elite. It's not a completely perfect allegory, but I think it kind of gets the point across. But anyways, so everything that is profane that we talked about in the last video in terms of esoteric occultism could just be represented by flat earth. It's as an allegory, it's a pure allegory. So you can see why they're obviously devoid of any proofs about it or arguments against it that are valid. Just demonizing it and having that programming growing up. Oh, can you believe people thought the earth was flat? What idiots. You know what I mean? Like that's what we grew up with. That's one thing that people are like, well, why?
Right.
Why are we told like that is such a huge deal? I mean, even if you think about it logically, say it is a sphere and people used to believe it's flat. Let's just say that for sake of argument, that's how it is. Why should we look down upon people back then who didn't have the tools we do now? Why is that set up to be such an insult? Even like, think about like in the 60s or 70s, like, yo, you're a square, man.
Right.
I mean, there's so many insults that are actually esoterically driven. Even like an asshole, like an ass's head is indicative of the Jewish god of Jehovah as the demiurge. And in this devil card, it's a goat's head, but it has the ears of a donkey. So it's kind of like a hybrid of a donkey. And so if you call somebody an asshole, it's kind of like you're calling them the demiurge in some esoteric way. So there's a lot of insults that are interesting that kind of correspond to this. So this is why I think that this is very strange, because the polarity that is created from this argument has so much more going on to it esoterically speaking versus just in the material world observation. And we can elaborate on that a little bit more in the next discussion. But that's basically all I wanted to convey here. And again, the below box, everything that's in the black, that's of the below, the earthly nature. And the above in the purple, that's the divine spiritual nature. And what is alchemy? You take the profane, you merge it with the divine, you mash it up, and you create this equilibrium. So taking a flat plane and creating a sphere out of it is an alchemical act in itself. That is essentially Baphomet. You're merging them together. And then when you have a picture from space with the divine light of the sun shining on it, and that deity is reflected back by Earth, which is the woman. Look in the Lover's card. We could discuss this a little bit more in the next episode. I'll just foreshadow it here. The nature of the spirit and the divine is exercised through the man, which represents the sun, essentially. The above sun is the spiritual sun. The man is kind of like the visible sun. He's looking at Earth, and Earth is looking back up at deity. So that picture of Earth from space is reflective esoterically of the Lover's card, because the Earth is the woman, right? The nature of man. And man has just a moment of gnosis or illumination with this picture. Hey, look, we're all one. We're all divine. That is what is reflected in the Lover's card if you apply the necessary allegories of the sun and the moon or the earth to the different archetypes.
Yeah, this is another great slide. And I will say before we move on that I believe what they're doing is they're taking the information that they have, the knowledge that they have, and they're using it for very self-centered, selfish reasons. And what you said before, Michael, is that they need the profane. They need it in their equation in order for them to be able to make their spiritual, I don't know, what do we want to say?
Alchemy?
Yeah, their spiritual alchemy come to light, to be a dream come true. So, so that's the thing. That's why it's selfish. It's selfish because they need to foster a profane environment in order for them to succeed.
Exactly.
And so, I don't know. To me, I look at that and I think to myself, okay, well, that is a very selfish agenda and it's not healthy.
And it's so interesting because so much of this stuff is about losing your ego and aligning with this highest divinity, where it's weird because from the doctrine itself, they believe that this isn't their egoic will, this is their divine will, which is so weird because it's like so hypocritical, at least from my point of view, and obviously it seems to be your point of view.
Yeah.
And that's something that I definitely like to elaborate on the next discussion, because that will get into all of these theological things that we can kind of comb through and see if we can make sense of in some way.
And that concludes another Sage of Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the show notes below. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can get to the blog by typing in sageofquayradio.blogspot.com or simply head over to our hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.